In today's video, we're taking a look at some NHL offseason rumblings concerning teams like the Vancouver Canucks, the Detroit Red Wings, Anaheim Ducks, and Vegas Golden Knights. We also have some updates from Boston Bruins training camp, and we also have some interesting news on 2020 European NHL draft prospects. We'll jump into all the latest news coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have a variety of things to discuss today. One of the things I want to start with here is the Boston Bruins training camp and the fact that they've had a couple of key players been missing for quite some time, and that's David Pastrnak, one of the league's top goal scorers, and fellow Czech winger Ondrej Kase. Now, both have been absent for quite some time. Lots of question marks, of course, with the NHL's new set of rules regarding everything in players' health. The answer is always just they are unfit to play or unfit to practice, and that's as far as we can get. But there were some images that have been circulating social media indicating that Pastrnak and Kase were actually spotted at a separate rink skating or training elsewhere, and apparently we did see information from Joe Haggerty from MusicSports. So it looks as though that those two players came into contact with somebody who's believed to have been positive for COVID-19, so they are basically quarantining as a precaution. Not sure exactly how long that's going to have to be. I would imagine they're being tested every so many days, but either way, right now, Bruce Cassidy and the Bruins are saying that there's no reason to think that the Bruins are going to be disciplining them in any way, but you can't help but wonder if the league might be involved in some capacity or looking at the possibility that they, were they in places that they shouldn't have been or whatever, because as we get further along in Phase 3 and into Phase 4, obviously these players are supposed to be in tight NHL bubbles, and if they do break any rules, there could be some consequences. But right now it looks as though they're okay and there's no discipline, there's no issues, but they could be out of Bruins training camp for some time, which could have an impact on how ready they could be when the season gets back and playing. And obviously, especially in Pasternak's case, it's such a big role for that team. You can't help but wonder if that'll impact their chances here in the opening early rounds for them to be able to make another deep playoff run. Now, as I mentioned as well, we have some information on some 2020 NHL European draft prospects. Now, the reason we're talking about just European players today is because of the European leagues actually right now are scheduled to start up in the fall between September and October as their normal times, whereas obviously NHL hockey will not be. And many other lower level leagues around junior hockey and NCAA hockey, etc., right now in North America may not be starting on time either. So there's a lot of question marks of where a lot of these prospects are going to play. But in the case of the European players, there's reports that if these prospects have contracts for the 2020-2021 NHL season, that they will not be able to break those contracts and go play in the NHL. So the problem is these players would have to take the chance and not sign, not play hockey before they're drafted in order to have that flexibility. So that really isn't a great situation. Many of these prospects are going to have an opportunity to get themselves on the ice and be playing some hockey before the draft. And obviously that's going to give NHL teams another quick look at them to make some final assessments before the draft takes place. So obviously that's an advantage that they have compared to some other North American players to be able to get themselves noticed a little bit more. But essentially European teams are not going to be overly fond of breaking contracts, so these guys could be stuck. So we're looking at players like Lucas Raymond, Alexander Holtz for sure. Over in Sweden, you've got Tim Stützle, one of the top prospects overall in Germany. Now, the German team and his coach had a quote indicating that they felt that whoever drafts Stützle is likely going to want him in the NHL and not to play in Germany. So they might be a little bit more flexible with him to be able to let him go. But essentially, it's going to be between the player and the team. If the team wants to play hardball and keep him with that franchise for the entire season, then they certainly have every right to do so. But it sounds like I said, Stützle might be the one exception here that has an easier time getting out. Now, we could also see some of the other North American prospects possibly sign contracts to go over and play in Europe. Of course, the only condition now is that they're going to want to build in an NHL out clause into their contract so that once the draft happens and they're drafted, they'll have the option to go to the NHL. Like Alexis Lafreniere, for example, or Quentin Byfield, they very well could seek opportunities over in Europe to be able to get themselves on the ice and play ahead of the NHL draft. But obviously, they're going to be wanting to go straight to the NHL if they're able to, so they're going to have to make sure the contracts are done properly. And same goes for any other existing players already under NHL contract, they very well could go play in Europe as well, as long as there's a loan agreement worked out between the NHL team and the European team. Then they can have that so that they can go back to the NHL when it starts up. I mean, right now, the NHL is targeting a date of November the 17th for a training camp with a December the 1st start time. That very well could change. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the world that's going to impact things, but that's what they're looking at right now. But I personally think that the big factor here will be, can they get NHL fans in the arenas for those dates? If it's not looking like it, I think they'll do everything they can to push it back even a little bit further so that they can get people buying tickets and going to the games, because they're going to be losing a ton of money. Obviously, not playing at all would lose them even more money because they lose a lot of TV revenue. So it's hard to say, but I know after getting through the part of the year that they have so far, assuming they're successful in completing 1920 with no fans in attendance, I can just see them delaying things if possible. But it's quite possible here we could see guys go to Europe that are not already there. If you take a look at the NHL franchises, you're going to have a good shot at selecting some of these top guys, because the players we're talking about here are expected to go top 10 or so. So you're looking at like LA, Ottawa, Detroit, Buffalo, New Jersey. Like, there's a pretty good chance these guys would have an opportunity to play in the NHL right away. So you can't help but wonder if, knowing the fact that they have to wait longer to get them over into North America onto their franchises, if that will impact their decisions on who they're going to draft. Would they maybe select a North American player higher just for that opportunity to get them in the lineup faster? I don't really think that's going to impact things too much. At the end of the day, I think teams, if they really, really think that player is the best fit and best available for their franchise, I think they'll take the opportunity and wait a year if they need to, because clearly these teams are not going to be jumping from the bottom of the standings to being, a playoff or cup contender just in 1 year. So obviously, I think patience would be had in those situations, but you never know. With some teams, it could change who they decide to draft when it gets to that selection time. Now, as I mentioned as well, I want to take a look at some offseason rumors and rumblings regarding a few NHL teams. Let's kick things off with the Anaheim Ducks. Now, there's a recent mailbag article from Eric Stevens talking about some of their veteran players that could GM Bob Murray consider moving. I mean, obviously the Ducks are kind of sort of going through a rebuild or a retool here, trying to get younger, faster, more skilled, move out some veterans. And there's some talk about some of the more veteran guys on the team. Could they become trade bait? So we're looking at guys like Josh Manson on the blue line, Adam Henrique, Jacob Silfverberg up front. In his opinion, which I agree with, Manson is the most likely possibility of all of them. I think he has the most value. He's still at a good enough age with a good contract. He plays the right side. He can be a different kind of defenseman a lot of teams don't have. And I think, obviously, as I mentioned before, I think Toronto would be the terrific fit for him. Looking around at all the teams that are really going to be somewhat hard up for right side defense, that are going to have some decent forwards to give up. The Leafs are a prime team that would make terrific trading partners for Anaheim. There's others as well, but obviously, like, the Leafs are going to have to shed salary. They're going to lose Barry and CC to free agency, have spots open on that right side. Maybe one of their younger forwards, like a Kerfoot, Kapanen, Janssen type of player, would be what they're looking for, or something to that effect. So clearly Manson makes sense that he would have a lot of value on the open market. I'm not sure about Adam Henrique. Basically, the response from Stevens, which kind of makes sense, is that if top prospect Trevor Zegras appears to be ready to be able to not only make the team but play a top 6 role, then obviously Henrique becomes expendable, but he still has a few years left on his contract, over $5 million. It's not going to be the easiest contract to move, so it might be challenging anyways. But if Zegras seems to be ready, then why not shop him around at least? And if he can move him, then make that happen to give him more of an opportunity. But in the case of Jacob Silfverberg, the writer felt that it really didn't make sense to trade him under any circumstances, that you need to have some veterans. He could be one of those guys who's a really solid 200-foot players, good influence on the other young players to teach them how to play the right way. He can contribute offensively and just be a really all-around good leader for that franchise moving forward. I mean, you got guys like Ryan Getzlaf only have 1 more year left on their deal. Probably doubtful that he returns unless he's willing to take, a much cheaper contract, like significantly cheaper. I mean, Getzlaf's still somewhat productive in his older years, so maybe he takes a short-term deal, kind of starts to go the route of a Joe Thornton, taking 1 or 2 year contracts for less money. Difficult to say, but whether or not he remains with the Ducks beyond the current year or not is certainly up for debate. So if you lose Getzlaf, you trade Henrique. Obviously you don't have a ton of other veteran forwards on the team, so maybe Silfverberg does make sense to keep around. Somebody's got to stay and lead the way, and where he's such a good solid 2-way player, kind of makes sense that he would be one of those guys. So if GM Bob Murray wants to continue retooling and really take this team a little bit further into a rebuild, I personally think his biggest trade chip, and the writer as well, would be Josh Manson, and there would be numerous amounts of teams, including the Leafs and others, who would be interested. So give me your mock trades for Josh Manson. Where do you think is a good destination, and what kind of return do you think it's going to take going to the Ducks to make that happen? Now, there was talk as well from Robin Lehner about the possibility of remaining with the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, we've talked about Lehner a few times here so far during this NHL pause about one of the more interesting players and where he's going to end up next year, because it's not really clear if he stays in Vegas or not, largely due to the fact that Vegas has extremely tight salary cap situation, and signing him without making a substantial other move would be next to impossible. But as we've talked about before as well, I think these playoffs are going to be a major factor in determining his future, as well as at least a couple other guys on the team. Clearly, Peter DeBoer, head coach of the Golden Knights, has made it known that both goaltenders are going to get opportunities to play. Marc-Andre Fleury, substantially older than Lehner. He's had a heavy workload in his 3 years in Vegas. His play has come down in the last 2 years. Of course, we saw this with Pittsburgh before. He ended up, being one of the really great young goaltenders around the NHL, worked his way up, got a Stanley Cup to his name, and then his play started to fall off. Matt Murray come along, challenged him, eventually took over the starting role. They did continue to win, got more cups under their belt, and then he had to be made available here and go to Vegas during the expansion draft because his career seemed to be on a downward trajectory. But then, going to Vegas and being moved seemed to really motivate him and wake him up, and he got his play going much stronger, and then it's been slowly down after that. Of course, he has 2 more years on his deal at $7 million. He's been a really solid contributor for Vegas, been pretty much the face of the franchise since he arrived there, has been the top pick in the expansion draft, and obviously, it would be a big blow to the franchise to lose him, but they can't afford both. So I think whoever plays better in these playoffs will be Vegas' goalie moving forward. I just don't see it being remotely possible for them to continue with both. But as I mentioned before, they would not have traded for Robin Lehner if they had more confidence in Fleury to be able to get that job done and have another shot at going back to play for the Stanley Cup. So let me know what your thoughts are. Does Robin Lehner have a shot at staying in Vegas? And if so, what does that mean for Marc-Andre Fleury in his future? Now, the other day, we talked a lot about the Detroit Red Wings and Steve Yzerman and all this flexibility and moves he's going to be looking to make during the offseason, and we have a little bit more to talk about here today, and that could involve him having some conversations and some dealings with the Vancouver Canucks. Now, I've seen reports that the Detroit Red Wings are obviously, as we know, is no secret, they need to find themselves a goaltender for the upcoming year. Obviously, Jimmy Howard is not getting the job done. He's not getting any younger. Likely does not get re-signed as an unrestricted free agent. Jonathan Bernier's left holding things there in Detroit. I don't believe he's really starting material at this stage of his career, but he can certainly, take on a decent amount of games. They could certainly use a goaltender for the present and for the future. So obviously they could go about this in a couple of different ways. Now, there's been speculation that I've seen today that the Red Wings have a lot of interest in both of the Canuck goaltenders currently on their roster. They really like Jacob Markstrom, and they really think that Thatcher Demko is one of the bright young goalies of the future and would be a great addition to their franchise as well. So if the Vancouver Canucks are unable to lock down Jacob Markstrom, I can see Yzerman and the Wings, according to this report, being one of the heavy suitors for his services, and they would be able to afford to pay him more than a lot of other more higher contending teams. So it's going to boil down to what's most important to Markstrom. I think it's pretty clear that based on what the Canucks have said and done recently and what we've seen out of Markstrom, that they would like to both remain him being the starting goaltender right now, and I think they need to work out a deal. It's just not going to be easy given their current cap situation. So it is quite a possibility, though, that Demko could be dealt if Markstrom is signed long-term. And there's a few more reasons for that. If you take a look at it, if they sign Jacob Markstrom to a 4, 5, 6-year contract, and it may not end up being that long, but obviously Demko's already getting to that point in his career where he's like 24 years old. He's going to be looking for an opportunity to be the starter. And if Markstrom is locked down for another 4 or 5 years, that's really going to create a difficult time for him to get into that starting position anytime soon. That's going to put him well further into his career. So that's, from his perspective, would be somewhat frustrating to not be given the reins to take over the starting job in the net. Now, we saw when he was given an opportunity this year with Markstrom being injured, he didn't really get the job done. So in my opinion, Demko still has a bright future, but I don't see him being ready for that starting job right now. So obviously, that poses problems for Vancouver and tough decisions. I think you have to live for the moment right now. You have to obviously take this group that's making big strides. You have to be positioned to be able to continue that. Now, he's not the only young goalie in the prospect system. They do have Michael DiPietro as well. So obviously, having one of these guys leave and during this offseason would be a really strong possibility here, in my opinion. So obviously, if they can get Markstrom signed, great. He's the goaltender for the next while. You can work on DiPietro likely being that next backup and, eventually, continue to develop to take on that role down the road. But if Markstrom is not signed, obviously, they have to go with a guy like Demko, maybe DiPietro, or they dip into the free agent market and maybe get a little bit more of a veteran to work with Demko for the short term here. But obviously, if things did not work out that way and Markstrom is signed, which I do believe is a Canucks first preference, obviously Demko could be traded. And the reason for that would be a couple of things. One, that creates the less likelihood that they lose him during the Seattle expansion draft, because right now if you look around the NHL and all the potential goaltenders who could be available, I think there would be a really high probability that Demko would be the player that the Canucks would lose to the Seattle franchise. So it kind of eliminates that and makes things a little bit more difficult that way. Secondly, it creates a situation where Vancouver, as we've discussed numerous times here in the last couple of weeks, they kind of need to trade some value in order to shed some salary, because teams are not going to take on bad contracts without getting some kind of sweetener in return. There's a lot of talk that maybe Besser could be that guy. Of course, we had all the talk from TSN Radio, Matt Sakaris, which I know Jim Benning has really kind of turned down and said there's no chance of that happening. But you know what? They do have to do something. Maybe giving up a guy like Demko to Detroit, who could maybe take on that contract of Louis Eriksson. That might be like the sweetener that they need to make that happen. They take on the remaining 2 years of Eriksson in exchange for giving them a real potential goaltender of the future that they're so desperately looking for, because they don't really have much depth at all in that regard in their system. So it could be another way to go for Vancouver and Detroit, with Detroit kind of taking advantage of their cap situation right now, being able to weaponize it to gain another really useful asset here in the short term. And at the same time, it helps the Canucks because it really eliminates a lot of cap space getting Eriksson off the books. It creates a situation where they don't have to worry about losing a goaltender to Seattle, and they could, potentially have a different strategy in that regard, assuming, of course, that Markstrom can be signed, and Toffoli can be signed. It can go a long way to helping all that take place. So let me know your thoughts down below. Does it make sense for the Red Wings and the Canucks to be looking at some potential deals here? And could one of the Canuck goalies be the starting goaltender for the Red Wings next year, whether it be through free agency or trade? Let me know your thoughts and we'll discuss further in the comment section. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.